I am very happy to introduce Victoria Sampson here to my right. Victoria is the Chief Director on Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. She has over 25 years of experience in military space and security issues, and the Secure World Foundation, as Robin mentioned during his opening remarks, is one of our partners for this conference, and they have been one of our long-standing partners in the work that we do. They've worked with us on tools such as the Space Security Lexicon and the Space Security Portal. And I'm sure you will be hearing about this and other things that we've been working on together throughout the conference. So without further ado, please, Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Almudena, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. As Almudena said, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation, if you are unfamiliar with it, is a nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all the long term. Our panel today, Mapping Threats and Risks to Space Security, a technical and political perspective. We'll go over all aspects of that. As space becomes more contested and congested, the danger of accidental, deliberate, or natural incidents is likely to increase significantly. Space systems face multiple challenges that have to be properly understood in order to be effectively mitigated. These challenges range from solar flares to the placements of weapons in outer space and elsewhere, the use of counterspace capabilities, use of space capabilities for aggressive activities, and the threat of use of force in outer space, from outer space towards outer space, or against space systems and their components. This panel will provide a technical and political perspective on the spectrum of dangers to space assets and personnel, discuss the challenges of distinguishing between risks and threats in space and potential for gray zone activities to create instability and possible escalation, and examine the consequences of space dangers in terms of driving arms race and increasing the risk of escalation both in space and on Earth. So really this panel is the why for the meeting, why we're going to be here for the next 2 days. Why is space security a concern? Why is it important? Why are we looking at various aspects of space security and stability? Before I introduce my panelists, I'm contextually obligated to promote the Secure World Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. It is a report that we put out every year. I'm the co-editor of. It's available on our website at swfound.org/counterspace. It looks, it's unclassified, and it looks at 12 different countries of counterspace capabilities, 5 different types. We have the report itself is in English, but the executive summary is translated into all 6 official UN languages. And this year we additionally have it in Portuguese and Japanese. I brought copies, but they appear to be gone. I have some more I will bring tomorrow. It's very heavy, so I cannot bring as many, one for everyone as much as I would like to. But if you have any questions about that, please feel free to let me know. And with that, I'm going to go down the line and introduce the panelists in terms of where they are on the website. Our first speaker is Andrei Yurovich Melov. Dr. Melov is a senior expert with the Center for Military and Political Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations since 2018. Since 1998, he has worked on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament issues at the Russian Foreign Ministry and has participated in negotiations on related issues. He has held the position of the head of Multilateral Disarmament Division and has also participated in negotiations on multilateral disarmament as the official member of the Russian delegation. He obviously is online. I should have said that to begin with. Our next speaker is also online, General Eric Cezanne Colangedes, who's the Chief Space Operations Center, Brazilian Air Force. Currently serving in that role, Major General Colan is responsible for conducting the activities of the Brazilian Space Operations Center alongside Navy and Army personnel with the objective of control and employ space systems to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the armed forces and other organizations of the Brazilian government structure. So next we had Jesse Ndaba, the Chief Executive Officer from Astrophica Technologies. Unfortunately, Jesse isn't able to make it. We have swapped another Jessica in her spot. Luckily, there was another Jessica registered to be able to make that switch. Jessica West is the senior researcher at Project Plowshares. Jessica leads research to advance peace and security in outer space through humanitarian focus on space for all and benefits for people on the planet. As part of this work, she interacts regularly with key United Nations bodies tasked with space security and space safety issues. Related research interests include approaches to peace and disarmament rooted in humanitarian protection and gender perspectives, as well as the impact of new technologies on space security, such as cyber connectivity and artificial intelligence. Then we have Dr. Russell Boyce, the Managing and Director of Mission Assurance. As a chair for Intelligent Space Systems and director of the UNSW Canberra Space, he has spent 10 years in orbit space R&D. He has also served as the chair of the Australian Academy of Sciences National Committee for Space and Radio Science and helped to establish the Australian Space Agency, SmartSat, CRC, and NICSAT, NSMEO, Aquawatch, and other national space missions. And finally, we have Ambassador Shen, the Ambassador for Disarmament Affairs for China. He assumed his function as the Ambassador for Disarmament Affairs in August 2023. Prior to that, Ambassador Shen has worked as the Director of the Division of Nuclear Affairs in the Department of Arms Control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Counselor for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva from 2011 to 2015, and thereafter, Deputy Director General of the Department of Arms Control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, supervising a broad array of disarmament issues. So with that, what we'd like to do is have our speakers just give a few opening remarks on the topic of today's panel, and then I'll ask questions. And again, people in the audience, both here and online, will have the opportunity to ask questions as well. But with that, I'm going to start just going down the line again. Dr. Malov, please have the floor for your opening remarks. Thank you very much.
I will be extremely brief. Just a few introductory words, if you permit. So, you know, the problem is that do we have the period when it is too late to make some preventive measures for the arms race in space, qualitative arms race in space? I think not. It is extremely important to make anything possible in this direction. The arms race in space, qualitative arms race in space, could lead to a new division of world. For those who possess or potentially could possess capable space military assets, including those of attack ones, and those countries which simply cannot afford, which making the whole political world picture similar to the division between nuclear and non-nuclear states. Based on the scenarios assumed by different experts and shared by me, it is appropriate to assume the following directions for the weaponization of outer space. First, it is the deployment of weapon strike systems, which will be aimed at protecting economic interests of space property. Second is the deployment of weapon systems designed to destroy or disable military space assets. Elements of space missile defense occupy a special place here. Third, the use of space weapons as a lever to strengthen political and diplomatic capabilities. And fourth is to achieve such overwhelming military superiority in space, which, as military and technical capabilities develop, will ensure dominance on Earth. What are arguments in favor of building up combat space potential? It's maintaining leadership in space. In many doctrines, we have this term. Protection of space property. The need to respond to qualitatively new threats like hypersonic weapons. The impossibility of practically developing a universal instrument to prohibit the transfer of arms race to outer space. And we hear a lot of arguments in this connection. So the deployment of strike weapon systems in outer space will have direct and extremely negative consequence for the entire range of strategic stability. The strategic stability itself will be changed, the nature of this strategic stability. We witness the process which leads to interchangeable nature of space assets, making civil assets to perform dual use. We just have been speaking about that, and we need a certain legislation to be developed. Such processes objectively work to undermine strategic predictability and, as a consequence, strategic stability, and to make the task of determining the scope of possible agreement in this regard, and not only agreements, but rules of behavior, to say norms, and anything like that in this direction. The scope of possible agreements, any kind of agreements in this regard, are very problematic task. In the context of an aggravation of political conflict, which we face, and a sharp aggravation of interstate relations in general, the neutralization, the so-called, of foreign spacecraft, or their manipulation, can lead to inevitable and, most importantly, instant escalation of the situation with absolutely unpredictable consequences. There are no prohibitive international legal norms with regards to a number of possible areas of space activities related to space strike weapon systems. The situation here is becoming more complicated by the appearance of new technological breakthroughs. Some of them have been touched. The process of the miniaturization of satellites, the use them in swarms, the new possibilities to secretly impose your will on hostile satellites, new forms of kinetic and passive, non-kinetic influence on space platforms. In other words, the qualitatively new possibilities of hidden and prompt anti-satellite potential coupled with the increasing ABM space potential and the new innovations targeted against the hypersonic weapons of different kinds. So this is the situation. The list of innovations could be continued. Thus, the assets in space are becoming more interchangeable, interconnected, and integrated, which as a consequence could make the eventual diplomatic work on the scope of application of potential legal international instrument or legal norms or even rules in this field more and more difficult. More than that, these new mixed and hidden possibilities of space assets in reality could create new forms of casus belli, and as a consequence, widen the potential areas of violations of any possible agreements and understandings, including bilateral laws. The question arises, is it worth continuing efforts to prevent an arms race in all space with an emphasis on preemption? Would it be better to focus on bans on specific elements of strike weapon systems launched into space, or the development of some so-called red lines for their use? It seems that efforts to promote preemptive measures with regard to the forced weaponization of outer space should be continued. In view of the present realities, the need to develop a multilateral legally binding instrument on powers, to my mind, has increased. And in this connection, we also only could support the adoption by consensus of the report of the GGE on Paris adopted in August this year. Thank you very much.
Our second virtual speaker, Major General Cullen, you have the floor if you're around. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, it is an immense honor to address such a distinguished assembly of expert diplomats, military representatives, and stakeholders from around the world gathered here to victory at the 2024 Outer Space Security Conference. Allow me to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research Unity and Director Robin Guys, as well Ms. Ortega for the organization of this important event. I would also like to extend my sincerest thanks to our moderator, Victoria Samson, for her guidance through this section, as well to my esteemed fellow panelists. I'm Brigadier Colin, Chief of the Brazilian Space Operations Center for over 10 years. I have been working on the implementation of space operations within Brazilian Armed Forces, with primary focus on defining responsible operation in space and promote safe and security behavior in critical domains. Our Space Operations Center was established in 2014, and we are responsible for operating both communication and remote sensing satellites. Over the 10 years, we have become a reference in Latin America in the field of space situation awareness, contributing significantly to the region effort in promoting safe and responsible use of space. The rapid growth of space activity has made the domain more congested, contested, and competitive. While space was once the domain of a few nations, now we see a proliferation of both states and non-state actors. The dynamic brings innovations, but it also increased the risk of misunderstanding, which could escalate into more serious conflicts and tensions, both in space and on Earth. Our growing reliance on the space-based structure has increased the urgency for ensuring that these systems are safe from both natural and man-made threats. We face diverse risks that range from space debris, solar flares, and cyber attacks to more deliberate actions such as the deployment of counterspace weapons. Each of these threats could have significant and potentially catastrophic consequences for us on Earth. A particular concern developing in the testing of anti-satellite asset weapons. These tests not only demonstrate a capability to disrupt critical space infrastructure, but also generate significant amounts of debris, which can remain in orbit for decades, posing ongoing threats to all space assets. Such actions undermine the collective efforts to maintain space as a safe and sustainable environment for all nations. In Brazil, there is a clear consensus that anti-satellite weapons are imprudent and should be avoided, as they threaten the stability of space operation and the long-term viability of the outer space. We believe that ensuring the security of our space is an increasingly urgent matter. It is vital for we come together as a global community to address this challenge, drawing up to shared experience, knowledge, and resources available to us, as space is a fantastic room where we are all together and security cannot be achieved in isolation. It requires collective effort and international cooperation. We believe that today, as we sit here together, we can set a foundation for meaningful discussion that will drive us toward a more secure and stable future in outer space. Brazilian diplomacy, along the military, has been working for years with the scope of the prevention of the arms race in outer space perils initiative, which seeks to prevent weaponization of space and ensure its responsible use. Together, all the nations aims to guarantee the security of the space operation and promote responsible in outer space. Thank you to be here today to participate in this event.
Thank you, Brigadier Glenn, for your thoughts and viewpoints in this matter. We look forward to hearing from you again during the Q&A. But next, we're going to go down the line to Jessica West. Jessica, you have the floor.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So although I share a name more or less with Jessie, there's no way that I can do justice to her work. So I'm going to speak briefly to two papers that were published earlier this year. One on gray zones of space governance that was published with CG. I'm here today as a senior fellow of CG, and they're one of the sponsors of today's events. And another that was completed with assistance from the Government of Canada, focused on human insecurities related to outer space and gendered perspectives. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit from the first speaker and talk about the gray zone in outer space, what that means and why it matters for peace and security, as well as collective safety and sustainability in space. The gray zone is generally known as something I like to think of as, passive aggressive conflict, if you will. It's a state when we're not quite in armed conflict or war, but we're also not quite at peace. And I also refer to it in the paper as a fog of peace. And this fog hides a lot of harms that I think don't necessarily receive sufficient attention. And I think some examples of these activities might be cyber interference with space systems, so capabilities that might disrupt or temporarily deny use of a satellite system, or cause reversible harms, dazzling of space sensors, but things that generally fall below the threshold of what we might think of as the use of force. But they're not benign. And I think it's important to remember that the space systems that power national security and armed conflict also power civilian and human uses of space and technology all around the world. So all of our global infrastructure is very much linked to outer space systems through what is an invisible web of data connectivity. And so when we think about harms that can come from disruption of those systems, we also have to think about civilian harms. We know from other areas of armed conflict or gray zone actions that civilians are often disproportionately impacted by these below threshold activities. And so I think that's one reason why this matters. And a lot of these harms, though, they're hard to see. They're often invisible. Gray zone activities also very much take place against a backdrop for the possibility of armed conflict. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well. So they're not benign, but they're also not entirely removed from the possibility of the use of force. And this happens for several reasons. First, there's an easy ability for such actions to escalate to armed conflict. And this is because in that fog of peace or the grayness of non-blowing things up kind of activities in space, there can be a lot of misperceptions about what's happening. There's difficulty often in detecting when there have been harms to a space system, in differentiating it from perhaps an impact that's naturally arisen from the environment. And also different perceptions of what harm is. And so different actors might perceive something as threatening and others as not. And so you can have escalation that is unintended. Technologies are also entangled. So a lot of the technologies that are used for gray zone activities in space, be they cyber or some of the robotic and remote activities that enable sort of close approaches and uncoordinated and uncooperative orbital activities, are also linked to peaceful uses of space as well as non-peaceful uses of space. And this blurring and blending of space technology also means that there is a greater ability for misperception and unintended escalation towards armed conflict. And finally, gray zone activities are also very much entangled with strategies for warfighting and with other domains related to the use of force. And so some examples include strategies for deterrence, as well as nuclear strategies, where you have both the technology of space systems being linked to those capabilities, and you also have strategies that are entwined with one another, for example, nuclear deterrence and space security. And all of these make gray zone activities, which can seem benign, below threshold, we're not necessarily discussing armed conflict, very much harmful in ways that can be hard to detect, hard to map. Mapping is a key theme of today's panel, and hard to cope with when it comes to space security strategies. So I'm going to end there because I don't want to go over time, but I think we'll be able to pick up some of these themes throughout the discussion.
Thank you, Jessica. And maybe during the Q&A, you can talk about your paper on gender. So with that, move on to our next speaker. Russell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, everybody. I want to give 3 comments, but they're going to take a few moments each. The first 2 come from the past decade in which I built and led a space mission program in Canberra in Australia. As a university team, we did some astonishing things. And let me cut straight to the punchline. It's possible for non-state actors, non-aerospace primes, it's possible for small, highly organised, skilled groups such as universities to do some astonishing things in orbit. And that totally changes the game. What did we do? We developed and launched a number of spacecraft. They were CubeSats, but they were very, very capable ones. And the most recent pair of those was a mission where we launched 2 spacecraft as one block on orbit. We fractionated them into 2. We were able to use our understanding and skills in lift and drag capabilities for spacecraft in the atmosphere of low Earth orbit to control the spacing of these spacecraft. Actually, I can see now on the screen behind me, if that animation gets going, that's the moment at which the 2 spacecraft separated from each other and they followed each other around the globe. We were able to move them apart, bring them back together, slide them past each other, about 30 meters spacing, go out to 100 kilometers, come back again. And we were playing games with radar operators. We were able to do that because low Earth orbit has atmosphere. The key thing I want to point out here, those 2 spacecraft, two key things, those 2 spacecraft in low Earth orbit acting together show you just how complicated the space environment is. If you've only got one, it wobbles around a little bit, you never notice because you get the track from the space catalogue the next day and you acquire it and away you go again. But if you've got 2, you realise these effects in low Earth orbit are enormous. Therefore, if we are going to get good at space security, we need to deeply, fundamentally understand the space environment. We need to understand our spacecraft and other people's spacecraft, and we need to understand the interactions between the spacecraft and their environment so that we can correctly attribute cause and effect. And that might just get us out of space conflicts one day by correctly attributing cause and effect. Second thing to point out, these two spacecraft were packed with technology from multiple optical systems that could take photos of the Earth, of other spacecraft, radio systems, onboard artificial intelligence, enormous amount of capability that a university group was able to put up there. So again, it's possible to do things which are going to cause problems depending on who's doing them. The third very, very different thing I want to quickly point out, we are democratizing space at a very, very rapid rate. Again, it's no longer the state actors, it's no longer the big aerospace companies. Pretty much any nation these days wants to become engaged with space, and many of them want to get into space and do things. Many of them do not have the training, the skills to be able to do that rigorously and sensibly, and it will be an increasing Wild West situation in space if we as a planet are not careful, and therefore it behooves us to be providing skills and training to emerging space nations so that they can responsibly do things with their technologies in orbit. And I'm actually part of an effort that's building to deliver such capacity building to emerging space nations. I'll pause.
Okay, thank you, Russ. And then our next speaker is Ambassador Chen. Ambassador.
Thank you, Victoria, and good morning, dear colleagues. Sorry for being late. I was in the Conference on Disarmament. We had achieved quite good progress in the Conference on Disarmament with establishment of subsidiary bodies, including the issue of space. And there are so many parallel processes when we are talking about the space issues. And yesterday I was in ITU. I was told that there is another event, Space Sustainable Forum, going on exactly on the same time. So indeed, space security, safety, and sustainability is very important issues, and very glad to participate in this event again after last year's session. Just now, my co-panelists discussed this issue mostly from technical perspectives and legal perspective. I would also like to share some of China's perspective. Maybe nothing new, mostly quite consistent positions, so I try to be short. We first, to begin with, the assessment of threats and risks to space security. We believe that should be a holistic view of the situation, not necessarily just focusing on the technical perspective, but also a political and legal perspective. At present, we believe that security of outer space is faced with a range of threats as described just now by panelists, including orbital congestion, accidental collision, space debris, and placement of weapons. These issues are different in nature and can fall into two different categories: space security and space security. The two categories of issues are different in terms of their levels of priority and have different solutions. Therefore, we believe that we should not just lump them together, nor confuse their level of priority. As far as China is concerned, we believe that the fundamental threat to outer space is a risk of arms race and weaponization of the space. If we fail to prohibit weaponization, if we fail to prevent the deployment of weapons in space, if we fail to prevent armed conflicts in outer space, then the space will be a war-fighting domain, and there will never be tranquility, and there will be no space security, no space safety, and no space sustainability. So the root cause for the weaponization and the heightened or escalation of the risks in outer space, we believe has something to do with the policies and the strategies aimed at domination of outer space. And driven by such policies and strategies, the combat-oriented plan to develop armament, build combat systems, and military alliances in the outer space. And indeed, just now, it was referred to not necessarily just the state actors, but also non-state actors, including some commercial enterprises, are also involved. It makes things more complicated. Secondly, I just want to explain that we believe that fundamentally the doctrine of countries regarding space is a fundamental has fundamental impact on the threat of to the space. Secondly, long-standing absence of an international legal binding instrument in preventing an arms race in outer space further exacerbates the threats to outer space security. The existing international law system of space, including 1961 Space Treaty, either focuses only on WMD or on in certain areas such as the moon. They do not deal with the test, placement, or use of conventional weapons in outer space. The use or threat of use of force against objects in outer space, all the specific obligations and responsibilities associated with commercial space activities. As a result, there is an apparent gap in the current international law system in terms of preventing weaponization of space, making it hard to sustain security in outer space. Filling that gap through legislation or legal interpretation should be viewed as an effective way to address the security threat in space. Past experience has shown that voluntary measures, including such as code of conduct, political commitment, or transparency and confidence building measures are inadequate in terms of preventing an arms race in outer space. Without a full-fledged legal system, there's no effective way to restrain, and the cost of breaking the code is negligible. Such norms, rules, and principles will become, in effect, rules of engagement, or sometimes cast aside. We have always heated discussions with our CRC on whether IGR should be directly applied to space, whether it will be justifying the war-fighting strategies. Recently, the group of governmental experts on further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space adopted consensus report. I still remember that day when our experts came out of the conference. They were so excited that after so many years, at last, the group of experts can adopt a consensus report. The adoption of the report has very big significance. Of course, when I read the report, there are still many issues left over, waiting for further discussions. But at least it demonstrates that the experts of the group and many states have common wish that there need to be further work to be taken to prevent an arms race in outer space, and the discussion will also taken place regarding the elements of possible instruments. Of course, there are different views, but we are ready to further elaborate on those issues. And we were very glad that the subsidiary body of the Conference on Disarmament was established this year, and hopefully it will be reestablished early next year. Then we can build upon the outcome of the GGE, and hopefully we can make further progress in developing possible legally binding instruments regarding the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And we have the PPWT on the table. Of course, there are also different views, but we are waiting for the response and the constructive suggestions to that draft, which is the only draft legally binding instrument on the table for international community to discuss. And to conclude, I would also like to stress that the security of space bears on the security and development interests of all countries and well-being of mankind. And this weekend, I watched a documentary film. It's Apollo Survival. And I'm very impressed by one observation from another Austrian astronaut who observed from the space, observed the Earth from the space, and his observation is that he can't understand why people on the Earth cannot live peacefully with each other. I do hope that space can be a place for peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
We will move on to our Q&A. And again, we're happy to take questions from the audience, but I'll start off with a few questions of my own. So And this can be for anyone on the panel who's interested, and also, of course, our speaker online. So the first question, what key technical specifications or characteristics of space systems should states be aware of in the context of establishing mechanisms to ensure space security? So we have space threats are often characterized into different vectors, looking at reversible or irreversible, looking at destructive or non-destructive. So is that a helpful way of framing things? Do you think additional technical parameters be included in discussion might help in enhancing understanding of these threats? So with that, anyone should take the floor.
Thanks, Victoria. The threats, you mentioned reversible and irreversible. So threats that might physically damage and destroy a spacecraft or might just be temporary. But I think there are other threats as well. I mentioned the satellites before that my team put in orbit. If somebody up there has a spacecraft and it's got intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities and it's got propulsion and it can move around, well, it can get up nice and close to your spacecraft. And that, without doing anything more than that, might constitute a threat or be perceived to constitute a threat. So one of the technical specifications I think we need to be thinking about is what can our and what can other people's spacecraft be capable of doing. But the other thing that I would like to propose is that, and I think I mentioned this in my preamble, we need to deeply understand our own spacecraft and the other spacecraft that are up there as well. And by that, I mean exactly what do they look like, their geometry, the materials they're made of, what is their surface charge, because that interacts with the ionosphere and it forces them to move around. What is it capable of, how fast can they be rotated and therefore change their effective area and therefore their drag? What I'm getting at here is how capable is the spacecraft at moving around? Can we understand that very, very deeply so that when a movement happens, we can say, yeah, that's because of natural effects, or actually, no, the laws of physics cannot explain that. Something happened that was human triggered. And if we get really good at it, perhaps we'll be able to say, and it was nefarious, or no, it was peaceful. So I'd like to propose those as additional technical issues that should be considered.
Thank you, Russ. Other thoughts on panelists? Jess, you're looking very enthused.
I think we can do a better job of understanding who the users of space systems are. I'm a fan of drawing people when I draw a space system. So we have the old standby of a satellite, a communication link, and a ground station. Well, we have to draw in all those connections to infrastructure, but we also have to draw in all the connections to people. And I think if we don't have an adequate understanding of how people are making use of space, it is difficult to think through the specific types of protection measures that might be needed in outer space. So we can do a better job of knowing who the users are, and even on the commercial side, knowing who clients and customers are. I think we'd often be surprised to hear of the many different ways in which space is used that we have absolutely no awareness of on a day-to-day basis. And those uses can very much be tied into everyday security needs of individuals on Earth.
Thank you for the question. And I still remember when we discussed these issues in various forums, including in the conference in disarmament, and also what I heard from the GGE that we talk about the four factors, and there are also two issues that constantly discussed and lead to some different views. One is the term of intention, whether we need to focus on intention or unintentional or accidental activities, because when we are talking about weapons in the outer space, our approach is try to focus on intentionally use of force or use weapons in outer space. And the second term is regarding the dual use. And when we are discussing these issues, it constantly raises that many objects have dual use purposes. So when we are discussing the weapon systems or the target of possible weapon systems, so what to do about the dual use objects, whether that can constitute a legitimate target for military forces, or whether some disruptions can be taken place on these subjects. I think these are also issues, whether it's technical or legal matters that need to be addressed in future negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Brigadier Cullen, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question?
I totally agree with my colleagues. I think to reach a full transparency in space domain, it will be almost impossible. You can have transparency. You don't have transparency nowadays in ground, maritime, as well, aerospace domain. So in space, we want to be different. But the transparency I think it should be reached in order to avoid problems to another one. What we were doing that can affect the other one in this situation. So I think the transparency, we should have a responsible transparency, avoid crashing with other guys and other assets in space, especially for these topics. And especially is related to commercial and state assets. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier Cullen. I mean, the thing I'm taking away from the speakers on the panel is the importance of, it's not just technical parameters, but sharing information, communication, establishing patterns of life, so that when these are in activities that are not regular, then you can identify them and move along from there as well. I think it's really important to be able to demonstrate good intent, and how do you demonstrate good intent? And that's a whole discussion in and of itself. But sharing technical information has been discussed, sharing ideas of understanding who the users are and sharing communication about them, and then talking amongst operators and different actors. I think it's going to be a helpful way to ensure that you don't have inadvertent escalation. We have one question from online. I think we're going to move to at this point. I'm just going to read it, right? Yeah. Okay. Tracy Wilson from OTH Analysis asks, building on Dr. Boyce's remarks about new actors in the space domain, whether it's universities or nation states, there's a trend towards new industry actors playing a role in space beyond traditional big aerospace companies. In addition to ensuring proper training for each of these new actors, are there new risks or legal regulatory requirements posed by these new actors that needs to be addressed? Anyone on the panel has thoughts about this? All right, Russ, and then.
So absolutely, there's risks because there's more players, and it's probably an n factorial problem. The complexity of the problem goes up and up and up, and the possibility for something going wrong at some point, if it's not controlled, if people aren't abiding by norms of behavior, that risk must be huge. Something comes to my mind. There was a case a few years ago where a small organization, I think it was a company, had the opportunity to launch something on a Falcon 9, and they did not have the necessary permissions for, I think it was a radio spectrum license. They launched anyway and started communicating. They ended up getting their hands significantly slapped, but the fact that they were able to do that, there was no safeguards in place to prevent them from getting into orbit. That's just a small example, I guess, of some of the complexities that this problem can throw up.
Yeah, I know the question already mentioned training, but I think to specify further, it's important for new actors to understand, I think, the prevailing security environment in outer space. And so one of the themes that is coming out, I think, of the conference already is also this blurring of sustainability, safety, and security. Even though we have different tools and buckets for them, sometimes they mix together, and actors who might perceive themselves as operating solely in the domain, say, of safety, might be engaging activities that worry others. And if they don't have an appreciation for the impact that their actions can have on the wider operating environment, I think that can be dangerous. So it could be an example could be a technology demonstration that is not well understood by other operators, and might not raise flags to the organization doing that demonstration, because the intent is for something benign, something peaceful. So not So I think there's a need for a greater awareness of what the comprehensive environment looks like and how new entrants play a role in that and how their actions can influence that environment as well.
Ambassador Shen.
Thank you. I just refer to in my opening remarks regarding some commercial companies. I think this is a new area that need further study. There are commercial companies, space companies, getting involved in military conflicts and providing military support to military operations, and such kind of activities will give rise to some legal issues involving the state responsibility if a commercial company is involved in military conflict without the authorization of national government, and whether such kind of activity will give rise to the state responsible for that company. So these issues need to be studied, and I think in the GG discussions, this issue has been raised, and it might be a emerging issue that needs to be further studied. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen. Yes, I mean, I think it definitely always comes down to the Article 6 obligations that are space strategy for providing authorization, continuing supervision. And if we're going to have new actors coming in, they're national actors, the governments involved need to make sure they have a common understanding for requirements in terms of what best practices their national actors need to provide. I think we're going to move as well to questions in the audience here in the room. So I saw one over there. If you can please identify yourself and your affiliation and then ask your question. And then please turn your mic off when you're done asking your questions and our mics will work. Thank you.
Good morning. Forgive me for my voice. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Thomas Gonzalez Roberts. Oh my God. And I'm from the Georgia Institute of Technology. I find it interesting that you describe the frankly arduous process for mission authorization and international coordination as one that is demanding of new capacity building measures for new actors in space to make them better at those arduous processes. But I'm curious why you don't advocate for instead making those processes less arduous so that new actors can navigate them with confidence and commitment to shared values of sustainability and security. If you agree with me, do you have any examples of how you can make those processes less arduous in the mechanics of spaceflight that you're most familiar with through your professional practices? Thank you.
So I don't know how to make the processes, am I on? I don't know how to make the processes less arduous, but I do agree with you. Let me give an analogy though to what's happening in the aeronautics sector. We are seeing proliferation of drones, advanced air mobility, heading towards quite disruptive changes in the air domain, and the space domain, I think, is going to be just the same, where we will see thousands and thousands of small objects moving autonomously, doing crazy things, and totally disrupting the way that we use airspace. And the FAA in the US has certain very, very arduous requirements for how one certifies such systems and then operates them, and the regulations that go with that. And it's the same problem. And I know that in that sector, there is a lot of grappling going on with that problem. How do we, on the one hand, coach the new players so that they come in with eyes wide open and can actually navigate it? On the other hand, how do we coach the FAA, work with the FAA and the other similar bodies to be able to take their processes into the future as well? But I don't know how we're going to achieve that in air or space. It's going to be tough.
Not an approach to make it less arduous, but your question also made me think about the need to have harmony internationally. And so I'm assuming the process is not the same across individual states when it comes to the licensing and the requirements that operators have to follow to make sure that they are being continuously operated and that the obligations that they have during space flight. And one area where we might progress is having shared understandings across states about what the supervision looks like, what obligations mean in practice, and sort of approaches to what are allowed in space, what's licensed and how. And so harmonization might help as well, especially when you have more and more space missions that are multinational and cut across jurisdictions, which we're seeing. And we've also seen some slip ups when it comes to governance. I think that has been caused by these gaps between different regulatory environments. So if the launch state is different than the manufacturing state. And so I think there's a lot we can do to simplify some of that as well.
Just add one comment that indeed, as far as security is concerned, usually it will get things more arduous, and one of the argument we have is that we need harmonization of regulations of different nations, and one of the approaches to developing international laws that can be accepted by all. That all private companies, all commercial companies will have one law to be abided by. That will make things simpler. But of course, the negotiation of such laws and regulations will be very challenging. But maybe if there is only one or a series of laws that can be abided by all countries, that will make things easier. Thank you.
If I could revisit the statement that it's really, really hard and we don't know how to go through to make this process less arduous. Let's take the conversation about 300,000 kilometers away to the moon. It's not going to be that long before we see different nation states and different commercial operators prowling around on the moon looking for places to dig up somebody else's moon. Whether we should or we shouldn't, let's put that aside for the moment, but realize that there will be some disputes taking place on the moon. That's my land. No, it's not your land, it's my land. Who bumped into me while trying to dig that trench to lay a pipe? We haven't done any of that yet on the moon. So maybe that's an opportunity for the world to get the processes right and less arduous with it's a greenfield. It's a clean sheet of paper. And then maybe we might be able to take lessons learned from that and bring it closer to near Earth space home.
Thanks, Russ. I think we had another question in the audience. Yes.
Thank you. It's on. Duncan Blake from University of New South Wales in Canberra, Australia. My question is about transparency. A lot of the measures that we might take to improve space security and stability would be improved by greater transparency, but there are limits on transparency. And do we need to just accept those limits on transparency? What are the limits on transparency? And is it possible to improve better security and stability in the space domain, even in spite of the valid reasons why state actors and non-state actors may not be willing to be entirely transparent?
Thank you. So are there limits to transparency and stability? And what are they? Any other thoughts from the panelists? Jess.
So I submitted a short working paper on the role of transparency to the GGE, and I think it's a great question because it really links these two processes and approaches to space security that we've been dealing with, the norms of behavior side and the weapons or formal arms control side. And I think transparency plays a role in both. I think there's a lot of ways to increase transparency, and I think it's a way that we can shrink that gray zone, if you will, by having a greater clarification around the edges and making it smaller. Are there limits? Yes. And the more I think about transparency, the more I've been thinking about, well, what are we doing when we're trying to be transparent? And I think it really comes down to what Victoria was pointing to when she's summarizing what we're saying. And a lot of it is about communicating. So communicating intentions, communicating capabilities, prior communication before actions are taken. And I think there's a wide scope to improve transparency by focusing on that communication mechanism, which is also a little bit less political in some ways. So having direct lines of communication and having better mechanisms and accepted processes for relaying information about space systems and activities. Will there always be gaps? Military people tell me yes, and that's your background, Duncan. So I'm going to say probably. There will always probably be limits at which states say there's some things I want to keep private. But I think right now, too much might be private in outer space, and we do have scope, especially if we focus on that sort of information exchange and communication piece.
In space, the same as on land, there are laws of physics that dictate certain things. For example, if you try to occupy the same space as somebody else, you're going to bump into them. There needs to be rules of the road. And on the ground, with the rules of the road, there is at least some transparency that is just a no-brainer. We might not know what a military vehicle is going, or where it's intending to go and what it's aiming to do, but at least we know that it's on the road and it's going to obey certain rules, and we can confidently drive on the road with it and not expect to crash into it. I think the same should apply in space. There should be transparency, at least to the extent of we are in that global commons together and let's not crash into each other.
Transparency, definitely, we believe there are limits. That's national security and the commercial interests. And we also need to take into consideration the situation, different situations of different countries. So for certain countries, transparency can be interpreted as a way of demonstration of their space capabilities and a way to demonstrate deterrence that's transparent in their policy and the capability to show that we can do anything in the space, and it is kind of deterrence against other countries. And that kind of transparency, to our understanding, might lead to a kind of arms race or competition in the space. So that kind of transparency we are not in favor of. Of course, most of the transparency measures are on voluntary basis. We are not against such voluntary-based transparency measures, so long as it will contribute to confidence building. It will contribute to enhancing the peace and security in space. That kind of transparency we will be in favor of. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand that Brigadier General Cullen wanted to add in on this discussion.
I totally agree with my colleagues. I think to reach a full transparency in space domain, it will be almost impossible. You can have transparency. You don't have transparency nowadays in ground, maritime, as well as space domain. So in space, we want to be different. But the transparency should, I think, it should be reached in order to avoid problems to another one. What we were doing that can affect the other one in peace situation. So I think the transparency, we should have a responsible transparency, avoid crashing with other guys and other assets in space, especially for these topics. And especially is related to commercial and state assets. Thank you.
I saw we had a question from one of the youth competition winners. If you'd like to give your name, affiliation, and your question, please.
My name is Prajna. I'm a Juris Doctor candidate at the University of Windsor. I have a question about interoperability. Interoperability has become a popular term during space development. Do you believe that interoperability will be a defining factor of future technology space development? And could interoperability mitigate the impact of threats by having other spacecrafts take up the mantle of the damaged one's capabilities?
I think standard setting is really interesting, and I think there's scope to get at interoperability through standard setting at a technological level. I like to think of it as kind of governance by stealth, if you will. And I think having shared understandings and shared approaches to technology that might spread across different users and different uses can be one way in which you bring transparency to how things are being used. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a move towards interoperability. Without, I think, good governance of that approach, it might end up being sort of fractioned or fragmented interoperability, which might be less helpful at a global scale if we're thinking about global security and conflict prevention. But I think taking moves to have, better standards on technology and working towards those collaboratively at a global level might be one way to quietly have governance emerge at a less political level. But on that standards, I wanted to say, I think norms are also really important. So that's not a technical approach, but to me, norms are sort of the behavioral approach to standard setting or standard setting of behaviors in space. And just to link back, I think some of the themes that have been coming up with dual use technologies, but also trying to understand different intent and questions about transparency and communicating. So I like to think of norms as also a sort of standard setting approach to behavior. And I think it's a really powerful way to communicate about intent and to communicate about possible harms. And so if you think about interoperability as technical standard setting, you can see that that might also be one way to have stronger communication more at an operational level than a high political level.
So one way to think about interoperability is the military context, but let's step away from that for a moment and think about it as collaboration. It's a very, very powerful thing when people or organizations or countries collaborate together to solve a problem, to solve a challenge. And there's plenty of challenges out there to solve, and space can participate in many of the solutions. However, imagine if we truly took it all the way to a complete system of interoperable, connected, communicating spacecraft. There is a disadvantage to that. Imagine that a nefarious cyber actor went after just one of them and succeeded. Well, that cyber threat could take out all of them. So there's pros and cons. The more we make them like each other or able to interact and collaborate and behave as one, the more we open up the possibility for mass scale network of space systems outages.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think they're different. We're looking at different threats with what we're trying to defend, whether you're trying to ensure the stability of space systems in terms of satellites versus spacecraft. Because I think, as Russ points out, with spacecraft, you do have like certain space flight safety considerations. You have interoperability for, if you have to get astronauts or taconauts or what have you out of your space station very quickly, it's helpful interoperability. But if you're looking at satellite constellations, that's not necessarily the threat you're looking at there. We did have one question from online. I think I'm going to ask really quickly. Thank you. From Pankaj Mehta. Can new technologies contribute to enhancing transparency and the sharing of critical information for space security? And if so, how can we balance the need for transparency with concerns about security and resilience when sharing such information? So the role of new technologies in helping with transparency and communications. If there are thoughts from our colleagues online, whether it's Brigitte Colin or Dr. Malov about this, give you guys right of first reply. Dr. Malov.
Transparency is extremely important, relying on new technologies, relying on secure file systems, coupled with the cyber systems. But it's pro or contra. You could use it for positive purposes, and both you can use it for, so to say, destructive purposes. It's just according to your inclinations. Technologies do exist, and that's it, period. The problem here is how to use them, how you use these technologies. For positive purposes or for, let's say, I did not want to simplify the things, or for destructive, negative. So it's a two-facet situation, you could use it either way. That's why it is absolutely, I think, counterproductive to say that what we are developing now in terms of the new possibilities of opening cyber systems with CQPIs, traditional CQPI systems, and command and control communication and intelligence, that could give you a more transparent way of doing things in space. Yes, on the one hand, yes. But on the other, you could use it for purposes which are not connected with the positive elements, I could give you just one example, The most vivid examples, the launches of the so-called advanced, extremely high frequency communication satellites, in the interest of the program Integrated Warfighting Solutions Beyond Active Defense, aimed at the adaptation of the developing global ABM system for passive and hidden prevention of the alien IBM launches. So these new technologies could be used for that purposes, to prevent the IBM launches. Could you imagine the consequences for the strategic stability of these new technological possibilities? So again, it's pro and contra. It's up to you what to decide, for what purposes you use these new technical possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malov. Other thoughts for the panelists and the role technology can play for improving transparency? Russ, reaching for the mic. All right.
There was the famous collision between an Iridium satellite and a Cosmos satellite. And transparency could have prevented that. We all thought that it was just bad luck on the day, and our knowledge of uncertainties and the likelihood of collision, just we didn't get it right. But as was presented in a paper at the AMOS conference in recent times, there was actually a thruster maneuver performed, just a small one, performed by the Iridium satellite in the hours before the collision, and it put it into the collision path and the two spacecraft collided. There was no communication of the knowledge, or there was no transparency of data taking place. And in hindsight, it could have all been prevented. Imagine if we used emerging technology, artificial intelligence, and instead of building a large language model like OpenAI does, imagine if we built something like a large orbit model. And imagine that wasn't just based on space surveillance data, but also the contribution in a transparent way by operators of, yes, I'm going to do a maneuver, or yes, I did do a maneuver. And it took place at this moment on this place. And if that data could feed into such a model, we could train more and more powerful systems that one day could be part of, for example, space traffic management systems. So I see that as one way in which emerging technologies combined with transparency could get us to a better place.
Emerging technology definitely will have impact on space security. Yesterday, when I was in the ITU, and one of the topic is also how AI will enhance the early warning systems in space safety. And I believe that emerging technologies, including AI, definitely will increase the transparency in the space area. And one of the issues we need to take into account is the technological gap between developing countries and developed countries. And all the surveillance data coming from a certain group of countries, while the others do not have that capability, it will be in a situation that a group of countries will make the decision who is whether the activities will be responsible or not. So in adapting the new technologies, we need to try to fill the gap of technology gap between developed countries and developing countries, so as to ensure the authority of the data that will be collected. And ultimately, we do hope that such kind of technology will contribute to a verification system that will be useful for the future legal dividing instrument. Thank you.
The question's a terrific plug for the final panel tomorrow on verification and monitoring. And there's a handful of terrific speakers that are already here. And so I think they're going to be diving into this question in a lot of detail. So please stay tuned. But I'll add that I don't think data enough is sufficient. And so I think there's a lot we can do with technology and generating data, but we also have to do the almost harder work in some cases of having shared understandings of how to interpret data. So what things mean, and making sure that that interpretation is consistent and shared across states and across different operators, so that we're not looking at the same picture, but drawing different conclusions.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, we are nearing the end of our panel. We're supposed to end at 12:30 our time, but I wanted to call again on the audience member in the back who I interrupted earlier. If you wanted to ask your question very quickly, please identify yourself and your affiliation. Ask your question very quickly because we have only a few minutes left. But I wanted to make sure you got your question out. Thank you.
I'll have mine of the One Goal Initiative for governance. So on the one hand, using AI to determine possible adversarial movements may automatically trigger attacks, and that may be very, very, very dangerous. I would caution against that. Secondly, as I was mentioning, concern that the private sector is becoming stronger is also a concern for investors, by the way, because the risks will not stop before them. We may grow, I would suggest going beyond what was already proposed, and because these states might say, oh, we are not in a position anymore operationally to impose anything on the private sector. So the question is accountability for putting themselves in such a position would be also in question. By the way, I was at the ITU this morning in that conference that was mentioned, and somebody, a representative there, approached this from a mitigation and operational action angle, in addition to legal.
All right, great, thank you. So the idea of very quickly, how do you get accountability for states and the state actors involved there? Would like to take the rest. Did you want to take prescribed?
So, yes, so nothing drives action better than dollars. So if we want to get accountability to happen, and if we're talking about the private sector, and you mentioned investors, yes, it is true. Investors are nervous about investing in space companies because of risk. Maybe if we can switch the conversation around, switch the mindset so that the onus is on the startups and the growing companies and the commercial players to self-regulate and not just leave it to the state actors or to the UN, so that the risk goes down, so that the investor dollars will flow in increasing volumes, so that outcomes can then be generated. Because, yeah, as I said, dollars can drive everything.
Thank you. And then I'm going to ask the other panelists if they would like to either answer this question or just give very brief closing remarks. Master Tim, do you want to?
Very glad to participate in this meeting, and my feeling is that, as I said in the very beginning, that we had made great progress this year, including the GG report, including the subsidiary body established by the Conference on Disarmament, as well as in other areas in Vienna, in Geneva, in New York. And possibly we are also looking forward to the future summit and outcome from that summit. And at that time, we are also facing great challenges in the space security. I have just listed a few in my opening remarks. We were ready to work with all partners to in a holistic manner to address the security concerns in space. And we do believe that there need to be a development aspect as well as a security aspect in that regard, in order to ensure the common security of space for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen. Then we have Dr. Mala, if you wanted to have some final remarks.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, it's extremely important to combine our efforts, despite the differences of opinion. Of course, they do exist, and it's normal that we have differences of opinion and different approaches. So I think it is extremely important to pinpoint or to focus on the major dominant challenges we face in this context, and the context of space security, and to focus our multilateral efforts, despite all differences of our opinion. And I think we have a good potential for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mala. Brigadier Cullen, did you have closing remarks?
I'd like to leave you with a message of hope and optimism. While the challenges ahead are significant, the spirit of collaboration and mutual respect that we are shared can allow us to overcome them. Space, though it has no borders, challenges our limits when it comes to the need for transparency, confidence, operations. It offers the opportunity to look beyond our difference on Earth and work together for a common good. We firmly believe that the future of space security lies in cooperation, not in competition. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And then finally, Jessica.
Today's discussion really points to the fact that if we want to think holistically about space security and governance, which I fully agree is the right approach to take, it means that we're dealing with a lot. There's a lot of different threats and there's a lot of different actors, and some of these blur with other actors and things that aren't threats but might be risks and safety and sustainability issues. So if we want to move forward on governance, I think it tells us that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the solutions and to the actions that need to be taken. And so we need to do a lot of different things when it comes to space security governance. I think part of that might be legal, either new laws, but also interpretation of what existing law means in practice and fleshing out what it looks like to implement it. We need better transparency or shared understandings. I think that is a norms approach, a behaviors approach, but also a data sharing and data exchange and communication approach. And I think we need institutions that can help us both develop these, but also cope with some of the uncertainties that we face. So things, means and mechanisms to facilitate cooperation, to facilitate communication and data exchange and dispute resolution or engagement between states when there are disagreements about what something means in practice. So I guess we have our work cut out for us. And I'm glad there's so many people here at the conference today who can keep contributing to this effort.
Thank you, Jessica. So yeah, I mean, just monitoring the session, I think they can agree that there's a whole spectrum identification of what the threats are to space systems, space security, and space stability. And with that, I think it's important to keep communicating and sharing information about these perspectives, because you cannot solve a problem if you cannot identify what the problem is. So I think conferences like this and the discussions we'll be having over the next couple of days would be really helpful, at least moving towards a common understanding along those lines. As Jessica just said, I think we worked together too long, so I had the same idea that there's no single solution to space security and stability. There's gonna be a whole host of responses. And so it's up to us to explore and figure out ways in which we can interpret these different aspects to make sure that space is a secure, stable, and predictable environment, so everyone continue to get the benefits and use of space. And especially, I think on my virtual panelists, I know it's frustrating to be not in the room, so thank you very much. Thank you in the room. So with that, please join me in thanking this panel for a fantastic start to the conference.